Hello. Recently, I conducted a webinar about my most recent book, Democratic Criticism, for the students and faculty of National University of Modern Languages, Islamabad. This is an edited version of that webinar. The link to the free digital copy and the paperback version of the book is in the description. So here we go. I will briefly talk about democratic criticism, my book, a little bit about what it's about and why I wrote it, and what does it propose to do as a book of scholarship. And then I'll answer any questions that you might have. Now, this book, the concept democratic criticism, obviously, and I mention it in the book as well, it comes from Edward Said, actually, his last book, which was called Humanism and Democratic Criticism. That's where I pick up the term democratic criticism. But the book basically is trying to engage two ends of a debate, right? The absolute freedom of expression and people's right to hold certain things sacred to them in terms of their faith and religion. How do we bring these two opposing, almost competing forces face to face and let them have a conversation? Because one, the freedom of expression, which I strongly believe in, is in its extreme form, it has an absolutist trend, right? I am a writer, I'm a poet, I have the right to say whatever I want. Whereas people who practice a faith tradition or religious believe that there are certain things that ought not to be said. There are certain things that are sacrosanct. There are certain things that are not permissible. So how do we bring these two face to face and figure out, what to do? So democratic criticism then as a concept, as I theorized, was this idea that in our attempts to represent or to write in our scholarship, we can't just come from our own immanent perspective, right? I can't just say this is where I stand and this is how the world ought to be. We have to do some kind of a transcendental scholarship. We have to transcend the very given of who we are and look at the same question from the place of the other, right? Which seems impossible, but to make an attempt to do that. Now, why did I start this project was because in 2013, I published an article which was called Democratic Criticism in the South Asia Journal. And the issue that I was trying to deal with in that was this question within the context of the satanic verses. And what I was trying to trace was not what Salman Rushdie said and why it was wrong or not, but the reception of the Muslim response in the Western world, both from progressive and conservative circles. So the Muslim anger or anguish or activism against the book was mostly represented as atavistic, as intolerant, right, as not sophisticated enough. And so my question was, we as humanists in America, we teach our students, be careful with your words, be sensitive to other people's beliefs, be sensitive to their social political identities. Why is it that we teach that in our classes in American classrooms, but we never tell our students, hey, 1.2 billion people are Muslims in this world. Majority of them felt offended by this book. Can we try to understand why do they feel the way they do? Or do we just simply dismiss their anguish and say, you know, the author has the absolute right to freedom of expression. So, why aren't we trying to understand that anguish, understand that anger, that pain? Where does it come from? What does it, you know, because if we did that as Western scholars, and I am one of them, right? Um, then we will be doing a kind of democratic criticism, a kind of criticism that engages not just where I am coming from, but how the other feels. So, in order to do that, I had to then go into the reception theory, right? Because if Rushdie's entire defense of his argument or his book is couched in authorial intention, right? And authorial intention being the sacred, right? And so if you read his essays defending the book, he assumes that the Muslim readers are unsophisticated and first need to be trained to read a book. And then he basically says, if you read it the way I do, this is what you will construe. And that's, I find it to be extremely patronizing and dictatorial. It's the author telling the reader, I have written this book, but you can only enjoy it or understand it if you read it like me, right? No author has a right to say that. The book is out there in the world. The reader must decide what its value is. So I had to go into reception theory and figure out, how do the reception theorists think about the reception of the work? And that's where then I go into the second part of the book, where I'm trying to trace what is it that makes this book transgressive. So I came up with the term poetics of incitement, which I theorize in the book. And the idea behind that was that there is a certain genre of literature in the West. This literature picks up the very things that are dear to the Muslims, things that are are not touched in our art or in our artistic renderings because of respect, because of the love, so the figure of the prophet, right? And and then these authors pick those topics and build a narrative around it, and then claim that they have the right to do that, which they absolutely have the right to do. But at the same time, when people, Muslim people, not even very staunch, fundamentalists, when they object to it, their response is not given any credibility. It's considered, you know, unnuanced and unsophisticated and intolerant. And that is what I call the poetics of incitement. So, my question to my Western readers was, if you are going to teach texts that deal with Islamic cultures and Islamic way of life and Muslims, you cannot just reduce those texts with the tools of Western theory. You have to know the basic history of Islam, the meaning making processes that are followed in the Islamic world. And without knowing them, you will just be reducing complex cultural representations to the matrix that you yourself immanently have, which is the Western way of dealing with things. And that is an extreme injustice and violence to these cultures. Just as Masood Raja cannot come into American Academy and say, hire me, I teach literature, but I've read all of it in Urdu translation, right? And I'm going to teach it with the perspective that I brought from Pakistan. No, people like me have to transcend our own cultures, learn the meaning making processes of the West, of America, and then teach and write about it. So the same burden must be borne by the Western scholars, by the American scholars, and teachers who want to delve into texts that deal with Muslim cultures. So that is what I was trying to balance, right? Between the scholars and students over here. And then on the other hand, addressing the Muslim readers and the Muslim audiences about they also trying to understand where does an author come from if they are writing about the Muslim cultures. Not everything is meant to be an offense. Sometimes it's curiosity, maybe misguided curiosity, but to be tolerant of that. So in the end, the book doesn't do both very effectively. Overall, then, if you read it, and what you will see is an argument that is a dangerous argument here as well as in Pakistan, because it delves into issues, mm, that are dear to people. But it does it with love, because with subjects like this, you can't come to it from a point of view of I am all that and I know everything. You have to come with certain degree of humility, and you have to come to it with love, and that is another concomitant lesson in the book, is how to do scholarship that does cutting edge work but does it with love. So that roughly was the project of the book. Now, the theory that I used was mostly reception theory. The question, obviously, that I'm trying to answer is, why is the satanic verses offensive to Muslims? And why is it that the way Rushdie tries to explain his stance, it in itself is very patronizing and imperialistic, and and that it is important for the Western scholars and readers to at least address the question of Muslim anguish and anger. Because if you don't do that, we are being imperialistic, and we are being the kind of humanists who assume that we know better, and that it is an imperial act to say, we have heard your concerns, we don't care about them, even as a scholar, but also as writers. And how best to teach my Western readers what is at stake if they don't do that, right? And on the other hand, encouraging the Muslim readers, so to speak, to read differently, read in a way where they hold their own opinions, right, and hold them dear, but at the same time can read a different point of view and respond to it critically, logically, without without being goaded into a reactionary response. Now, a little bit of a story of its publication. I had the option to publish this book with a very prestigious publisher here, but I pulled it at the last moment because I wanted it to be published open access, right? Because the raw materials that I'm using in this book so much of them come from the Muslim world. I wanted the book to be affordable to the general reading public in the Muslim world. Sadly, not many people have read it. That's okay. So that's why I published it with Lever Press, which is an academic press, but it is an open access press. So that means anyone with the link can download the book and read it. Now, if you wanted an example of this kind of nuanced scholarship where you have a basic understanding of both the cultures, what does it take for a person to write a book like this? It takes knowledge of two cultural traditions, right? The vocabularies of the Western Academy and the vocabularies of my own primary culture, Pakistan and the Muslim world, right? You have to be there to be able to write a book like this. And even the title, right? I know आप सारे लोग अंग्रेजी पढ़ रहे हो तो उर्दू शुर्दू ये वो आप लोगों के लिए इतनी अहम नहीं होती. But the title itself is coded, right? Uh, the cover, because when the publishers sent me three possible covers, there were two in Arabic and this one was in Persian, right? So the Arabic one was a copy of a 14th century letter by a trader to another, which was not relevant to the book. They chose it only because it had Arabic on it. The second one was just a page from some student from 14th century who had done some calligraphy work, right? And this one was in Farsi, right, which usually we don't associate with the originary Muslim Islamic language, right? But it was from Nizami Ganjavi, right? It was from the 13th century, and it comes from his poem Khusro and Parvez. But the lines that are visible here are kind of the my own life, right? Because it says, "Ba- Bataksiri ke az had pesh kardam, khujalat ra rafi rafi khwesh kardam," right? Shafi khwesh kardam, right? Basically, I exceeded so much in my sinning that I made the shame of it my advocate. Right? It's such a beautiful verse. So I chose this title because it's a challenge, right? To my Western readers, of course. Okay, you're going to read this book. I didn't put any inscription about the cover in the book because I was like, you want to talk about the Muslim world, go figure out what the title says. That's kind of a subtle challenge. And also to all of you, because part of our colonial legacy is that we have jettisoned whatever was beautiful about our cultures, you know, poetry. And then in the 80s, we suddenly decided that Arabic was more important to us than Persian, even though Persian is part of our national language. So that's roughly my ideas about the book. It did not get the kind of reception I had hoped, especially in Pakistan, and despite the fact that it has been freely available. But that's okay, you don't write these books to see if you will get any accolades. Part of it is to put yourself on record, right? We have one life. Um, and towards the end of it, as I've seen many people who have passed away, all we look at it is how we have lived our lives, not what we had in it, but how. So I think if I don't write any other books after this, I would be okay because this kind of says what I wanted to say about cross cultural work, about works that deal with these issues of cross cultural significance. So, overall, this is all that I have to say about democratic criticism. I'm hoping you'll have some good questions and we can continue our conversations, about the book or about anything else that's on your mind.
I wanted to ask, I've read your article called Competing Habitus, National Expectations, Metropolitan Market, and Pakistani Writings in English. And I found a lot of similarities in the sentiment within this book and also in that article. However, in that article, the focus was more on the author and how the author should write. And in this book, the focus was more on the reader and the critic. My question is, what caused that shift in thinking or that shift in approach
Mhm.
that made you decide to write a book on the reader and the critic rather than the author?
Yeah, good question. I mean, one main reason is that, as a scholar, as a living scholar, you constantly grow. So you write from one perspective, and then suddenly 2 years, 3 years later, you realize, oh, I need to go here because you have traveled, you have learned. In that essay, which actually one of the Pakistanis completely misread and misquoted, but that's okay because some people build a career on those kind of things. The argument wasn't that the author should write like this, you should read it more carefully. The argument was that in order to understand the representation, let's say, of Muslims, but also of Pakistan, we cannot reduce those texts simply by close reading, right? So we have to look at what is the horizontal difference, right? And that comes from Hans Robert Joss. Like the horizontal difference is that people's expectations are at a certain place and a work is offered at another level. The gap, the horizontal gap, is that the reader has not yet reached that threshold. So the response then comes from that gap. People are here and the author is here. My second argument in that was that the Pakistani writers writing in English are not writing in isolation, right? They are writing to an international audience. The very moment they write in English, they are addressing an international audience. And within that, there are already certain cultural stereotypes about Pakistanis, about Muslims, which are operative in the West. Now, do they perpetuate those stereotypes or do they complicate them? What is their responsibilities as authors? And my example was the Granta's special issue on Pakistan. Because when you read it, here are these authors, right? They've been given a chance to represent Pakistani culture. I'm not saying, tell fairy tales about Pakistan. But what do they choose? The tropes that they choose are the very negative tropes that the West already employs about Pakistan. Why can't we give a more nuanced account of Pakistan? Is Pakistan all about beheadings and, rapes and murders, or do people love each other and take care of each other too? My point is, yes, they do, right? Can we represent a kind of Pakistani culture where there is some room for hope? So basically, what it wasn't what the authors should do, even though towards the end I remind them of their responsibility, but that understand the context in which you are positing your point of view through your storytelling. And that context is that you're entering a contested domain where your culture is already maligned and derided. Do you perpetuate it or do you complicate it? Right? That was the question in that. Moving to this one, the reason there is such a heavy focus on reception is because the satanic verses and response to it is a reception response. I have no quarrel with Salman Rushdie. He can go and write whatever he wants, right? So I didn't want to challenge his writing because what am I going to do? Or he doesn't understand Islam or he's insensitive to Islam. That's a very basic argument, right? Or he didn't truly represent anything. How can someone truly represent anything? What I wanted to then trace was this book caused a lot of pain and anger in the Islamic world, which is reception. And how can we understand that pain and anguish and be attentive to it, be responsive to it? So, hence, obviously, since I didn't want to prove that Salman Rushdie somehow doesn't understand Islam, which I had done in my master's thesis actually, uh, but rather, can we understand the pain and the anguish of an average Muslim reader? And to do that, then you have to go to reception and reception theory.
Dr. Raja, can I please request you to explain the sixth chapter of your book a little? That is reading differently the case of the Taliban. Because, as per our perceptions, Taliban is a very, you can say, a controversial subject. And I would like my students to develop an understanding as you have presented it in the book.
Well, when we think about the Taliban, we just assume that they just came to be, right? One is that all the intolerant, anti women men And we assume that Islam does that, that Islam produces these kind of men. And that's how the West sees it. What I tried to do in that was to suggest that there are always material causes of such emergencies, right? The same Islam that, you know, produces Taliban, so to speak, also produces people like Abdus Sittar Edi, right? And people who love and care for humanity, you know. So, what I was trying to suggest there is that in order to understand the Taliban, we have to understand the material causes that create it, right? So, there is a vacuum in Afghanistan. The Americans and Pakistanis, of course, created Taliban. Um, to be very clear, we are still supporting them. So, to understand something such as a Talib, we have to see what kind of life of deprivation they have lived, what brand of Islam are they following, right? If is it a Salafi Islam within that, what teaching? Because there are different ways of interpreting the Muslim sacred. So reading differently then meant that, look, I conclude that chapter with a saying of Caliph Abu Bakr, right? Because when he is elected or selected as the first Caliph of Islam, he gives a khutbah, right? And in that khutbah, what he says is that my job is to empower the weak and to curtail the power of the powerful. That is a revolutionary stance, right? And that means that if you understand power and how it moves, let's say, coming from Foucault, power is diffuse. But one thing that I've always found perplexing is that power, as it courses through the body politic, and if it is left unchecked, it always concentrates, right? It seeks more power. And eventually, we then have these nodes of elite power structures. That is the natural flow of power. It oppresses the weak, overrides them, and then goes and collects, becomes kind of a monopolistic power, right? So if you look at that sermon, that khutbah, what is it trying to do? It is trying to stop the natural flow of power. Instead of power moving upward and concentrating, it is bending it to the least powerful. That was the revolutionary potential of Islam, early Islam. Not that it did conquered this and that. No, anyone can conquer territories, but to bend the natural flow of power in the body politic, right? Now, Taliban then are a total opposition to that because the system that they create is an oppressive system. It's a system that oppresses the weak, that is anti-Islamic, right? Anti-Muslim. So that was my reading in that chapter. But mostly that in order to understand Taliban or ISIS, we have to understand the material causes too. Not necessarily to always blame the West, because that is, being a victim, that means we are passive, we have no will of our own. But to understand that ideology is one thing, material causes are another, and we have to take into account both. Taliban would have not been possible without American involvement and without constant Pakistani support, uh, for which I will always criticize Pakistani military and government for enabling a government in the neighboring country. Pakistanis here in Dallas area are so perplexed when Afghans hate us. They don't realize that we are enabling the oppression of Afghan people at the hands of Taliban, destruction of Afghan culture. And that is why they hate us. Okay. But that's a different topic. That's also what we scholars ought to do, of course.
Dr. Raja, your work is on democratic criticism, right?
Hmm.
Isn't the time very undemocratic for its, the way it has come to the scene? The time is out of joint. The governments and the political order, it's very undemocratic. So, how do you see this paradox?
Or I have no reason to see it as a paradox. I mean, the times can be whatever it is. My job is uh, to write, whether it exists or not, to think a different world, right? As a scholar, my job is not to represent how time is. My job is to speculate how it ought to be or how it could be as a scholar. Uh, Not that I can change anything, but I don't see the contradiction or paradox. It's like saying that during Ziaul Haq's time we should have not talked about democracy. The systems in place are the systems in place. They are there, have always been there. The role of the intellectual and public scholar is to think beyond it, think contrary to it, and work for change. So that's how I see it.
But my question here is, which I am discussing with my students as well while teaching Pakistani literature in English, is that counter arguing an argument for the Western world is something very important. So, what are the dynamics that students should follow, and we as teachers need to teach them to present the case in intellectual and scholarly perspective to the Western world and to the writers who are writing. And as you said in your other essays as well, that writers choose those things that makes people threatened about this society because of extremism and the things that are happening. So I would really like to hear your comment about that how to deal with these things. And don't you think that the works that have been done by the Western writers, the best way forward would be to create counter arguments in the proper way so that the Western world can understand the perspective of the southern side as well as the rest of the South Asian countries are doing already, and we are lacking behind. So, if you please would
Mhm.
comment on this.
Well, I mean, that's a very complex question for me to answer just like this. First of all, to be relevant in the world as a scholar, you have to know your own culture as best as you can. And you have to know where the debate is in America, in Canada, in the Western world, in your particular field. It cannot just be this is my little inch of territory of ideas and I'm going to talk. You cannot just speak from the meaning making processes and vocabularies of your own culture and hope to have an impact. You have to understand the other. So, to pose any kind of challenge to any kind of Western assumptions about Pakistan and elsewhere, the knowledge that you ought to have is first of all, how are things posited here? Where is the debate? And then offer your assumptions and your response within that larger debate, which a lot of people in Pakistan are doing. The problem in Pakistan isn't that there is no counter response. I think the problem is that people are trying to offer the counter response, but within the domain of their own knowledge. The greatest impact that Muslim writers or South Asian writers that we apotheosize and we really, really venerate were the people who were a product of both the cultures. Why is Iqbal so great? Not because he was Hafiz Quran or something. No, Iqbal is great because he knows his Western philosophy as well as his Eastern philosophy, right? He can talk about Nietzsche, but then he can talk about Al Ghazali as well, right? It's that kind of formidable knowledge that you will need. Why was Edward Said so successful? Because, he could speak six languages, he knew the Western canon, and then he knew the Arabic canon, right? History and philosophy. To be formidable as scholars, you will have to own your own heritage, Urdu literature, for example, and its history, Farsi literature, right? You will have to know the languages of your own culture, a few of them, have the knowledge of it, and then know where the debate is in the West. So the burden of representation is double on us because we have to know where the fields are here in the United States or in the West and what we can bring to the debate from our own culture. Not about we have done great things too, ships do not sail on the winds of yesterday, as someone had said. But having that kind of a nuanced knowledge is important. So your students, they are English students, um, ask them, have they read the great works of Urdu fiction? Have they read their great poets? Do they know, what is the most comprehensive history of Urdu literature that comes out in 1858? Do they understand Ghalib, right? Do they understand Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Parveen Shakir? If they are English students and they don't know anything about Urdu literature and live in their English silo, chances are they will be speaking Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and, writing poems about daffodils and stuff like that. They have to learn the great monumental works of their own culture. They have to read the Muslim philosophy, then go and read the Western philosophies and theories, right? And a combination of two then will make them into the kind of scholars that we need to represent or to complicate the debates about Pakistan or, whatever Pakistani writers in English are doing to convincingly challenge their assumptions as well, right? So, roughly, that's my convoluted answer to your question.
Dr. Raja, I just wanted to ask one question. You just said to curtail, I mean, you quoted that to curtail power, you know, uh, I mean, to bring equality, the power has to be curtailed. But my question is that who would keep a check and balance on the one who curtails the power of the powerful?
The people.
Would they be able to do that?
You cannot run any culture or society without people having the power to challenge the powerful. And we don't look in all faith traditions, right? Um, it is the people who finally stand up and say, answer my question, right? And the powerful have to answer that. If people are browbeaten to a point where they concede their right to ask questions or right to ask for justice, right, then power will keep concentrating upwards. So how do we do that? We constantly, and Spivak has a wonderful recipe for it because she says humanistic education can train our people, our students, to think critically about their own lived conditions and then think critically of the world beyond them, right? So we have to encourage our students to think critically, but think critically not as is the trend now, right? Our students, somehow, what I've noticed in Pakistan, in my experiences, is that they think being rude is being resistant. No, being disrespectful and rude to your elders no matter how corrupt they are or whatever, is not resistance. It's just being rude. But being consistently someone who asks questions and builds lateral solidarities, cross religions, cross cultures, is that is, in my opinion, is the way. And the intellectuals must play a role in it, the public scholars must play a role in it, but they are not the leaders. The people must be critically educated in a way where they build solidarities to challenge power. That's roughly a humanistic answer to that. Revolutionary answers can be many. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Raja. It is so refreshing to hear your thoughts. My question is most related to building on your democratic intellect ideas. Is that in Pakistan, what I have seen is a lot of people who either aspire to be intellects or are in academia or are teachers like ourselves, they would necessarily, in their own silos, in their own academic institutions, among themselves, talk about, democracy of thought and maybe criticizing the people in power. But when the time arrives, when the government acts a certain way, when certain institutions will take over, will curb voices, um, then you wouldn't see the academic institutions leading the way. Whereas when I put it in comparison to India, of course, it's not a one size fit all, but most of their intellectuals coming out of their academia will criticize when the time comes, will talk about, power when it is abused by the government or institutions. My question to cut short is, why do you see, or how do you see that difference? Why do you see that Pakistani intellectuals in certain institutions might be the best in their own heads or are the best institutions in the country, but you don't necessarily see the academic intellectuals leading the change or calling out when power is abused? Why is there that dissonance, that gap? Thank you. You already know the answer to that question, right? I mean, India is a democracy, has been a democracy for over 75 years. Imperfect, maybe, but they are a democracy. The speech is protected or was protected until now. They have had no dictatorships. They have had no general coming and telling them how to live their lives. So when you have a thriving democracy with a highly, educated intellectual population, that creates the kind of mindset and praxis that you see in their scholars. We have had more than 35 years of military dictatorships, maybe benign dictatorships, but we have not developed a democratic political or intellectual culture. Even our politicians, you know, even the best of them, are intolerant, right, and do not want to listen the opposing point of views. So materially speaking, it is perilous in Pakistan to speak openly. What are the things you can't even touch upon? You can't touch religion because somebody will put a fatwa on you. Your own students will report you and call you names. You cannot touch the military, right? You cannot criticize them openly without getting in trouble. So, what are you left with? Politicians, right? You can criticize the political parties, which weakens the political process itself because you're speaking the language of the military then. So I wouldn't blame the Pakistani intellectuals or scholars for not doing. Some people have done it, right? Historically speaking, but it's perilous to do so. So we always must realize that we can only do what we do within the limitations of the space that we are in, right? And Pakistani scholars or writers, right? They live in Pakistan. They have to raise their children in that country. They have to make a living. So, unless the structural changes are such where it is no longer perilous to speak openly about topics or write political work, right? Those structures have to be in place for scholars to be active participants. But there are people in prison right now who did do that. People have been disappeared for their dissenting voices. So, speaking against power, not as a heroic act, but an everyday act, is only possible when we create a system, a political system, which is based in tolerance and rights and rule of law, where certain institutions or people are not above law, where you have a strident free press. India has all these things despite Modi and BJP, right? They have not been able to wipe out the progressive liberal left of India. We have never had that. We had the left in 1970s, then it got destroyed in Zia era, and it never really thrived like that. So I think mostly I would not blame or deride Pakistani scholars or intellectuals for not doing enough. I would rather criticize the system within which they have to survive and measure what degree of risk can they take, right? That's all I will say about it.
Thank you so much, sir. I just have one follow up. I don't want to take everybody's time, but when you put it this way, that the blame has to be on the system and the blame has to be on the structure, then where does my work come in? Why then I should write if I don't have the ability to talk to my students openly about what is happening around them, how institutions will be shut down because a certain something happened, and we will meet 2 weeks later as if nothing happened. So where does my work come in? Am I to say that I am helpless in this situation?
No, there are ways of doing radical work without being radical. I've done it over here. You can do it. We had teachers. Look, in eighth grade in military college, Jhelum, we had a teacher named Professor Anuddin Alvi, right? And in eighth grade, we were discussing the concept of takdir, and he could openly tell us that he is an atheist. Okay. Now, I'm not saying be silent. I don't think so. Pakistani scholars are silent. But you figure out in oppressive systems, you figure out how to build solidarities, how to do the kind of work that is coded, that challenges the norm, but that most people who are not in the know will not even understand. But we do all that we can do knowing what the limitations of space are for us. But if you can build solidarities, if 15 of you can come together on a campus and push back, you will have an impact. If you try to do it alone, your own colleagues will turn on you. Okay. So, what I'm saying is there are ways of building solidarities. You can build solidarities with your students, right? And then figure out what is the least you can do, not the most, at least the least to keep your humanity intact and build on that. The system will change only when you, me, and everyone else incrementally keeps working on it, right? So you do what you can, you pass it on to your students, you talk to your colleagues and see who are sincere, who are also feeling oppressed, and then you come together, right? You make a union. You go to your rector and say, our faculty is unionized. What is he going to do? Fire all of you? But he's going to divide you, right? He's going to say, okay, Dr. Humera, आपको हम dean बना रहे हैं और आपको इतनी तनख्वाह, just keep reporting to us what your colleagues are doing. That's how they break you, right? So you build solidarities with your colleagues, right? You check it out. You have a meeting and say, these are our grievances. What can we do about it? There'll be people who will sell you out, right? But if you do it alone, chances are you can be silenced, you can be hurt. But if you build a solidarity, then the system will change, right? That's all I can say about it, because I mean, I did that in Pakistan Army during my career. Some people stood by me, but eventually I became a target. I did that here in United States in my own department. I had people in solidarity with me, but when people started targeting me, you know, I lost, right? But what the lesson I learned was that it is important to have people in solidarity with you, right? And to work in solidarity with others.
Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Raja. I really appreciate this.
You're welcome.
Sir, I have a question that your book, Democratic Criticism, like who's the audience of your book in Pakistan? How does it speak to or reach to every Pakistani? To me, I think democratization of criticism is not realistic in Pakistan, where writers, teachers, and even researchers can speak openly or freely, and they often face censorship indirect or directly. So, how is it possible for us to write something freely? And the major question is, who is the audience of your book when we all are oppressed?
Well, the audience is international. It's you people and also the Western reader, and the book states it very clearly who my audience is. Are you an undergraduate or a graduate student?
A graduate student.
Okay. So, first of all, I'll advise you to not give up so quickly, right? Um, you can say things in your work, you can criticize power in your work, right? Right now, can you write against Shehbaz Sharif, or would you get
Yes,
in trouble?
obviously I will get in trouble.
How would you get in trouble? What is he going to do to you? Do you
Because
think
all the
Shehbaz
people,
Sharif has enough time to read your essays? Or anyone, Imran Khan, right? But part of it is how you do transgressive work. What are you going to criticize? If you tomorrow write an essay that says women's rights are not being represented aptly in the current government, I don't think so. The current government is going to come and take your home, right? But there are limits to what we can say and what we cannot say here in United States, right? If the Trump administration wants to come at me right now, they have to go to is go to my YouTube channel and watch my videos in support of Palestine. I'm sure they'll find something there for which they can indict me, right? So first of all, you have room to do critical work, right? Engaged critical work. You can talk about women's rights. You can talk about minority rights in Pakistan. You can agitate for rights of the people in the street. You can write a blog about why it is not fair or good to evict all Afghan refugees, right? These are the things that you can opine about as a writer, as a journalist. I mean, your journalists are putting their lives at risk already. Can you get in trouble for it? Yeah, maybe. But to assume that you absolutely have no right to criticize anything in Pakistan, I think it's a defeatist mindset. And I disagree with that. I have seen people in Pakistan producing work right now that is courageous, that is, far reaching and pretty, gutsy. So I would say, do a little more research, talk to your teachers, but don't give up.
but sir, in Pakistan, yeah, many people have faced trouble by just writing a few lines on social media. So,
Mhm.
what's your point about that?
But social media writing is not scholarly writing, right? If you want to anger people and have a little bit of impact, I mean, write an essay. Okay, let's say you are not happy with how women's rights are represented in the parliament. You can say three sentences on Twitter, which means nothing, or you write a really articulated response. You go and read Fatima Marnisi, you go and read Muslim you know, muhaddisat, you go and read your books, and then you write a 30-page article which says women traditionally had these rights in the Muslim societies, these are the rights women have in the Western societies. This law being made by this government is un-Islamic and undemocratic. That's scholarly work. Writing 3 sentences on Twitter is not scholarly work, right? You are training to be a scholar, not a Twitter writer, right? When you go to social media, you can go as Masood Raja, nobody, or you can go as a scholar with 5 books and 50 articles behind your back. Then what you write over there is backed by that opinion, right? So, yeah, people can get in trouble, right? I could get in trouble, you know, by saying things about the army chief of staff or whosoever, or about your rector, right? But is that a fight I want to fight, right? Or do I want to basically say, this is where I can go. There are always avenues for criticism and for writing. People did that in Ziaul Haq's time when we were growing up, right? So all I'm saying is that it is not impossible, and to assume that it is impossible is defeatist, and it will not serve you as a scholar or anything. Uh, Talk to more people around you. There are always ways, sophisticated ways of doing critical, powerful work.
Sir, I wanted to ask, you're mostly writing about uh, democratically reading of Islamic, like you're talking it and you're situating the argument in around Pakistan. You mentioned about Allama Iqbal and Maududi, and then you also talk about the narratives of the Taliban. So my question is, what is your say on applying democratic reading to religiously marginalized groups within these Islamic states or within states? For example, we have Christian marginalized community, and in India, Muslims are marginalized. So, what does this say on applying democratic readings to such groups narratives?
Absolutely. I mean, that is your job, right? I have done mine, imperfect as it is, but I have always been an advocate for people who are part of the oppressed groups, people who are part of minoritized groups. That comes across pretty clearly in my entire work. So, you know, scholars like you or someone else can build on that and write on that. Absolutely.
Dr. Raja, I want to ask a question. Um, like Pakistanis are in a love hate kind of relationship with America. Some people simply consider America as an alien country who is out to get us, whereas we as scholars have studied there, we have seen the academy. There are amazing people, obviously, there as well as there are in Pakistan. So I would like to ask this question with reference to your book, The Religious Right and the Talibanization of America. Can you please reflect a little on the material conditions which create similar kind of subjectivities in America as they are created in Afghanistan and in Pakistan? Like the people who become like there are insurgencies and there are problems because of the material conditions, obviously. So can you please um, tell us a little about American environment and conditions? What happens to people over there that they turn into Taliban's?
Well, I wasn't saying that Americans will become Taliban. Talibanization, as I theorized it, was a mindset that has a scriptural understanding of the world, right? And is terribly afraid of secularization of the public sphere. So, my reading of America, especially the far right, religious right in America, was that what saves America isn't its military power or its economic might. What saves America is the civic imperative. And the civic imperative constitutionally is that there will be no state mandated religion. So America is not a confessional state, even though most of their laws and constitution itself is pretty Christian. So what saves America is this idea that there is a civic state in which there will be no officially mandated religion. If you take that away from the American policy or American constitution, then the tendency on the right is to become increasingly more intolerant towards things that we consider part of modern American life. And that is what I call Talibanization of America. That if this civic imperative is removed and we let the religious conservatives in America follow the path of the kind of America that they want to make, they will increasingly go back to the interpretation of the sacred from a very restricted point of view. Women's rights will be curtailed, gays and lesbians would be, destroyed, minorities will be looked down on. So that trajectory, the material cause for it in America would not just be poverty and inequalities, but it would be actually taking away the laws that protect the distinction between state and religion and let the religious right run with it. In case of Taliban, it's the same thing. There is no civic state, right? And so that is what I was tracing at as Talibanization of America in that book. And it is happening. You can see that wherever you weaken the civic structures of the state and let one confessional group, one religious group define what is right and what is wrong, I think inherently, in terms of how it will unfold, is the most powerful group that has the right to interpret what is the sacred will become more powerful, and the system would become increasingly more intolerant for those who don't follow that line. So that's my reading of American culture. But you're right. When I criticize America, I criticize American power, but there are millions upon millions of decent Americans who care about the world and who don't agree with their own government. And we have to keep that in mind. Right? We have to remember them.
Okay, so Dr. Raja, does it mean that the symbolic representation and then the material facts of a society, of a culture, or a country as great as America, does that make any difference? Like having a different symbolic representation and then like the like I mean the difference between the actual conditions.
I mean, every country, has a self representation. How do we create the narratives of a nation? America has its own originary narratives. It has its constitution. It has its histories. Those histories are unfair. They don't account for what was obliterated, what was destroyed. So at the end of the day, we get a sanitized official history, which is then complicated by the work of radical scholars, right, like Howard Zinn and others. So every nation builds a narrative, right? Retroactively sometimes. Pakistan has its own narrative, right? It's a narrative of Muslim League ने पाकिस्तान बनाया. Muslim League कभी पार्टी थी यार, इसमें क्या इधर से एक नवाब पकड़ लो, उधर से एक वडेरा पकड़ लो. That's how we created the Muslim League. So I mean, but in the sanitized narrative of nation, Mr. Jinnah single-handedly creates Pakistan, which is a normative narrative in Pakistan. But then people in Sindh are saying, GM Sayyid, who supported Muslim League towards the end, usko humne gaddar bana diya, right? In Pakistani narrative, Bacha Khan was a traitor, right? A guy who could convert Pashtuns into pacifists became a traitor for us, right? So there are always competing narratives, right? The question is, how does the nation imagine itself, and how do you, me, and everyone else teach it, right? Um, that is where the difference occurs. I think what saves America even now is that American institutions, even high schools, are not afraid of saying, this is what is the official narrative, but here are the voices of people who were silenced, right? If we can do that in the Pakistanis, then the material conditions as they are and how the nation self represents itself through its formative and historical texts, then there is a room for our students to figure out, oh, not everything that is taught to me is actually true. There is another side to this story as well. Like I always ask Pakistani students, do you know who like Sobo Gyanchandani was, right? Or Palajo, these wonderful writers from Sindh, right? Um, Similarly, have you read, you know, Dr. Khan Sahib's work? Have you read Bacha Khan's work? Because if we don't do that, then we can buy into the official narratives, right? Um, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
A question regarding how we can approach democratic criticism if we choose to do that in our scholarly works. Um, Being the type of nation that we are, we do tend to be a bit sentimental, and it's difficult to separate your emotional attachments to certain narratives, as you mentioned in, like, for example, satanic verses. That it's not quite easy to separate ourselves from certain biases or emotions that influence our writing. So, in democratic criticism, if we choose this approach in our scholarly work, how can we avoid uh, being reactionary in our approach? And is it okay to be reactionary in our approach? And up to what extent? Because in post colonial literature, we also talk about like resistance and reactionary and all of that. But do you believe it's necessary? How necessary is it? Does it have any role in our democratic criticism or not?
Well, I mean, I won't say being reactionary is never really good, because that means that you have always given the other the right for the first speech and you are just responding to that, right? That's why reactionary politics was the biggest danger to the Marxist revolution. Uh, I would say there is no harm in being passionate in your scholarship, right? In being eloquently passionate, right? There is some, beauty in positive rage, right? But on the other hand, a good mixture of passion and emotions and logical reasoning works better, right? So think of when you studied rhetoric, when they taught you writing, there are three ways in which we offer our points of view. So we have ethos, which relies on our own ethical standing as a person or as a scholar. We have logos, which is the logical reasoning about any given topic. And we have pathos, right? The passionate representation of facts or whatever. So a good work then will have a mixture of all of these. Logos, in a sense, if you're a Pakistani writer responding to something that has come out of an American book or American text, you place yourself, right? I am a Pakistani woman, 21st century. I live in Islamabad. This is what I do. You are placing yourself, you're mobilizing your grounding, right? And then you say, this is how I read it. You're teaching the other side. You have said something about my culture. Let me tell you how I respond to it. You're educating the other side. Why is it that so you give a genealogy of your response, right? And then you bring in passion as well and you connect it. So it would be like a choreography, right? You have to have a beautiful mix of logic, your own credibility as an author or as a writer, and and a passionate argumentation for something. And that would make a really formidable response. But simply saying we are being victimized and we are being silenced, I think that is not really effective. Pointing to your own state of being victimized may work to some extent, but no, it's pointing to your own equal humanity, I think, is what is more important. So I think in democratic criticism, I mean, it's my book, I wrote it. What I liked was that I was not afraid of being funny at times, but also being critical of my own self. But when I take someone to task, you know, I take them to task, right? And I am unapologetic about it, but I'm kind, so that kind of a mixture I think would work well.
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Raja, for your insights. It's been a great experience for me. I want to ask you a question that is related to religious sectarianism within the Muslim community. How do you think religious sectarianism within the Muslim community impacts the democratic reading of a text? And how, what implications does this have for your concept of democratic reading or criticism?
Well, I mean, you know, what is at the core of sectarianism? Basically, it is an interpretation of the sacred, right? Some people follow Imam Jafar's interpretation, others follow, Imam Abu Hanifa or Imam Malik. Basically, it was a question of interpreting the text and then saying, these are our responsibilities, these are our duties. That's where we started, but it immediately also becomes political. So, as scholars, we tend to think beyond our sects or where do we come from. So, what I would encourage then is to any kind of sectarianism, religious, or I mean, Said would call it affiliative structure. That as scholars, we always entrench ourselves in a certain mode of thinking. So I think being eclectic in your approach is an important issue. You can be a Marxist one day, and then you can look at it, I think, from a non Marxist perspective. Similarly, you try to understand, okay, if Saudis are interpreting this thing this way, is it because there is something terribly wrong with Saudis, or because they are following the teachings of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal as sifted through Abdul Wahab? That gives you an insight of why do they read the same thing like this, and so do the Taliban, because they all come from that Salafi school of thought. And you to look at the Iranians, how do they look at a certain specific part of religion or practice? What are they reading and how are they interpreting it? That gives you the insight about where is someone coming from in terms of sect, and how are they then interpreting something that impacts people's lives, right? Right there, the lives of minorities in your culture, the lives of women in your culture. Knowing the nuances of where do these sects come from and how do they get politicized, what are their original texts, right? I think will enable you as a scholar to look at these interpretations and then work away towards a more tolerant, you know, political system or cultural system. You know, I come from a part of Potohar where, we are Rajputs, but we also have Rajput Shia and Sunni, right? And so we didn't come from this state of heightened in sectarian differences, but I would say knowing what is important to the other and respecting their space as long as they are not enforcing that onto you is the first step towards tolerance.
Dr. Raja, it was very interesting, very informative, and at the same time, you can see your popularity graph. It was on a very short notice that we asked all the scholars and the faculty members to join. Why? Because Dr. Raja is coming. And there were 90 plus participants. So you live in the hearts of people here, though you are far away. So the deepest gratitude from my side, from the department, as well as from the dean. Dr. Arshad, because of some personal commitment, has not been able to join, but he has conveyed his special thanks for your favor, for your generosity, and for your gratitude. And I am all, no words, more words. I don't have any words to say thank you to you.
Well, thank you all so much, and I really enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to talk to you again. Thank you, Uzma, for inviting me, and Dr. Farheen. So you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.